Welcome. Welcome to this experimental course, and I want to thank especially the University of Haifa for providing this incredible office, which I think is maybe twice the size of my actual office at home, with an incredibly interesting variety of books, which I appreciate very much. We're going to be beginning 10 lectures in this experimental format on the history of Galicia, a very underappreciated and exciting part of the East European Jewish experience. It's forged in 1772 by the dismemberment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and is surviving into the reformulation of Poland in 1919. However, actually survives even beyond that. It survives that in the mythological Galicianer Jew, unfairly, in my view, remembered as a coarse, backward, ignorant, so on. And he lives on in the immigrants who leave Galicia at the time and also today in popular memory, and not only with Jews. You see today in Ukraine, Galicia is not only a memory, it's also alive and well, celebrating the apples coming out of the province of Galicia. We're going to be looking at the history of Galicia in the context of the East European Jewish experience. And here's the general overview of our first lecture. First of all, we'll speak a little bit about this East European Jewish era and what it meant and why it was so important. Then we'll look at, for maybe 10 minutes, the history of the partitions of Poland and the so-called invention of Galicia, to quote one scholar, how Galicia is created out of thin air from the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And finally, we'll spend the bulk of today looking at the confrontation between Galician Jews and Habsburg rule. And this means especially the legacy of the first two emperors of Galician control, Maria Teresa and Joseph II. So let's speak a little bit about this thing, the East European Jewish era. And here you have a map of Europe just before the partitions of Poland in the end of the 18th century. And you can see the Polish state on the right-hand side, one of the largest states in all of Europe. Jews come to Poland already in the late Middle Ages. They're invited there by the kings, and they're also being pushed out of Western Europe at the same time. And they're given specific benefits and charters that were quite attractive, guaranteeing certain rights and protections and so on. But over time, they develop actually a much better relationship with the Polish nobility, who really have most of the power in the state by the 16th and 17th century. And they begin to move away from the royal towns, which were predominantly in the north and west, and towards the privately owned towns of these Polish magnates, especially in the south and east, in today's Ukraine, and especially in what's in later Galicia. And here they become the managers of the estates of these magnates, controlling the means of production. They're running the mills, the breweries, marketing agricultural products, other economic activities, some money lending, but not all like the common stereotype. The so-called arenda system, where Jews are managing the economy for the Polish magnates, whereas the ethnic, what will later be called Ukrainians, tend to be the peasants in this society. And they have this relationship, the Polish nobility who protected them, and the Jews managing the Polish feudal system. And in this context, we have this incredible, which the historian Simon Dubnow like to talk about, eras of Jewish history, the great East European Jewish era. Why do we call it that? For a variety of reasons. First of all, just the numbers, just the demographics. You have a huge growth in Jewish population from 1500, when you have maybe 24,000 Jews in the entirety of the area. By the end of the 18th century, you have nearly 1 million Jews. By the end of the 19th century, you have some 6 or 7 million Jews in that same territory. Absolutely astounding. And Jews are, as we'll see later, highly urbanized, which means they didn't just live in these numbers, but they lived in such concentrations that they felt they were living very much in a Jewish space. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. And second of all, the cultural influence, that by the early modern period, the Jewish cultural, intellectual life in Poland becomes the dominant in the Jewish world. And by the way, in 1939, some 90% of Jews in the world are either living in Eastern Europe or immigrants from Eastern Europe. So this truly is the dominant culture. What do I mean? The yeshivot, the Talmudic academies, become the model for Talmudic study in the rest of Europe. Students are coming from Germany, Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, even Italy, coming to Eastern Europe to study. The Polish masters of halacha, of Jewish law, are the dominant influence in the Jewish world. So, for example, the halachic rulings of the Krakow in Galicia, the Krakow Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, remain dominant in the Ashkenazic world to this day. The Talmudic commentaries of Shlomo Luria, the Maharshal, unsurpassed. Kabbalah, which is not born in Eastern Europe, but it grows there in such unprecedented ways. So a book like the Isaiah Horowitz's Shnei Luchot Habrit, the Shalah, goes through hundreds of printings. The mystical traditions of Kabbalah from Poland blend in with local occultic beliefs in really exciting ways. Even women's literature, the famous Tsena Urena, which was famously, supposedly for women, but on the front cover very famously was described as for women and men who are like women. Men who really need this sort of book also, which the publisher, of course, knew meant almost all of the men. That's also coming out of Eastern Europe. And eventually, in the 19th and 20th century, we have all the forms of modernism, meaning Zionism, Jewish secularism, Jewish socialism, political orthodoxy, Yiddishism, and much more. All of this coming out of that period. And this is the reason, perhaps, that after the Holocaust is a certain nostalgia, a certain grappling for what was lost. So you have, for example, the following, a very famous essay by Abraham Joshua Heschel. And here's how he describes Eastern Europe, the world that he comes from. Here's how he describes it. Korzych, Karlin, Bratslav, Lubavitch, Ger, Lublin. Hundreds of towns are like holy books. Every place is a pattern, an aspect, a way in Jewishness. When a Jew utters the name of Mezhebuzh or Berdichev, it's as if he were to utter a holy name. A splendor emanates from ordinary acts. It's superfluous to speak of faith, he writes, for who does not feel the presence of God filling the entire universe? To preach to those Jews the necessity of observing the 613 precepts would be banal. To live according to the Shulchan Aruch becomes second nature. But the Jews wanted more. They wanted to be higher. Miracles no longer startled the people. And it was believed that men endowed with the Holy Spirit were not uncommon. The latter generations were no longer considered inferior to the earlier, no longer looked down upon as epigons. This is Heschel. Obviously, this is pretty problematic for a variety of reasons. First of all, there's no distinction made whatsoever between radically different forms of Jewish settlements. It collapses small and large towns, Galicia with Lithuania, isolated rural Jews with massive Jewish communities. This mythical town has no non-Jews virtually at all, except maybe the cliche of the drunken peasant and so on. And it's an ideologically driven image. Modern Jews see the shtetl either as the root of Jewish backwardness, or you have Yiddish or post-Yiddish neo-romantics who see it as the embodiment of Jewish authenticity, something like Fiddler on the Roof. But as a good friend of mine once put it, where are the Jewish prostitutes from Lublin? Where's the violence? Where's the crime? All of that is crushed over. So what we want to do here, through the lens of the Austrian conquest of Galicia, is to see the overview of this magnificent era from the time of Poland's partition by Russia and Prussia and Austria until the Holocaust and even after. We'll keep some comparisons. We'll keep some perspective while we try to understand the history of this particular province of Galicia, and in particular, the last 3 or 4 lectures when we get to World War I and Galicia is reincorporated into the entire body of Poland. We'll look at the region as a whole. So we come to the partitions of Poland. Poland had an inherent strength. It was wealthy, actually, and the grain trade in particular was quite important. But it was also quite weak, because while the states surrounding Poland, especially Russia and Austria and Prussia, but also most famously France, are developing the new absolutist model of monarchy, developing larger tax structures, larger standing armies, Poland failed to do so. Poland remained a commonwealth of nobility, where if a single nobleman vetoed any legislation attempt in their famous parliament, the Sejm was exploded, and that was it. So on the one hand, you have this state, this massive territory with massive wealth. On the other hand, it wasn't able to develop, for example, a standing army at a time at the end of the 1700s, when Russia, Austria, and Prussia had standing armies in the hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Poland itself had maybe 20,000 soldiers at a territory the size that you see on your screen. That's quite problematic. On the other hand, the nobility themselves were quite powerful, and that power was very important for the Jewish community, because the Jewish community had this alliance that was key to all of it. The Kehila, the Jewish community, the Jewish community structure, the Kehila, was achieving heights that it never achieved anywhere else in history. Unprecedented levels of self-rule with a highly ramified structure. And the abolition of that state would be a critical step in the eventual, if slow-coming, liquidation of this Jewish corporation and the transformation of the Jews a century later. So what happens to the state? Well, you can see on your screen. The westernmost portion will simply be invaded and taken by Prussia. That's the portion surrounding the district of Posen. The lion's share of Poland will go to the Russian Empire. Eventually will be divided between two parts. You can see on your screen the Kingdom of Poland in the west and what will later be called the Pale of Settlement in the east. And this is essentially the countries of contemporary East Central Europe. This means the Baltic states, Belarus, White Russia, Ukraine, and even parts of eastern Poland. All of this in the Pale of Settlement. But we are interested in the part that Austria takes, the slice just north and east of the Carpathian Mountains that would soon be rechristened Galicia. And over the next century, and here we have Galicia, over the next century, two contradictory processes are happening. On the one hand, the pre-partition feudal economy is continuing for many decades, particularly the relationship between the still powerful Polish nobility and the Jews' unique economic niche as the commercial class in this economy, and particularly certain sectors, most famously and most problematically, alcohol. On the other hand, over the next century, centralizing impulses from the absolutist monarchs in Berlin, in Petersburg, in Vienna are going to attempt to break down this relationship, to curtail Jewish autonomy, to integrate the Jews into the urban classes of those states. And the tension between these processes, between the momentum of the feudal economy and the relationship of Polish nobility and Jews on the one hand, and the attempt by the absolutist state to break this down, and the economic, legal, and ethnic strife this produces, this is the driver of history that we're interested in. And also one of the drivers that's going to separate these Jewish communities, so that by the time you get to 1919, although there'll be certain commonalities between Galicia and other parts of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there'll be things that are quite unique and different as well. Different empires, different impulses. So for example, and by the way, keep this in mind, that the emperors, it's not like, I don't know, Nicholas I or who Alexander I is waking up every morning in Russia, and he wakes up and he stretches his arms and he thinks to himself, how can I screw with the Jews today? How can I mess with them? How can I persecute them? How can I do things with them? They weren't that important. But rather what we see is that what happens to the Jews is a byproduct of the nature of the state itself. So for example, when the partitions first begin, Jews are going to face a far more activist state in Austria than in Russia. And this means it's going to seek to radically reshape all of society, not just the Jews, but including the Jews. This is a social and economic parallel, if you will, to the cultural tension between a Yiddish Hebrew-based traditional Jewish society and the influence of Russian, Polish, and German culture on the Jews. You have a cultural interaction going on that's going to transform the Jews in different ways, but you have a socioeconomic political difference that's going on that's going to influence the Jews in different ways. All right, so let's begin to take a look now at the invention of Galicia, this new conquest. Galicia is conquered in the very first partition in 1772. It's rechristened the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria. It was a name drawn from history, coming from the emperor's claim to this land as also being the emperor of the Hungarian Empire and so on. Nobody believed it, nobody cared. It didn't make a difference. The Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria was the largest of the empire's crown lands or provinces. It extends 31,600 square miles. And if you look in the map on the upper right-hand corner, you will see the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After Austria splits into the dual monarchy in 1867, we'll talk about that some other time, you see Galicia is forming about a quarter of the entire Austrian piece of the empire. The capital, Lviv, is renamed Lemberg, and 150 years of Habsburg rule begins. And it really is a scenic, largely rural region. Beautiful, on the opposite side of the Carpathian Mountains. And it makes it seem even more distant than just in miles alone. And by the way, I have to just say, if you go to Galicia today, there will be some examples of the Soviet impact from the post-war period. But by and large, this is the image that you will see when you go to Galicia today. It remains today this sort of wonderland. And of course, in popular memory, how much more so this wonderland mourned for decades with its own mythology. And from the Austrian perspective, too, it seemed to be some sort of barbaric colony. Really, maybe contiguous with the empire. But it's a colony that needs to be tamed and needs to be brought into the empire. And this, by the way, is going to include the province of Bukovina, on the far southeastern edge of Galicia. It'll become part of Galicia until 1861 when it's separated into its own crown land and will develop its own history. It will have many similar characteristics. For example, the Hasidic movement will also grow quite strong in Bukovina, but because of the ethnic and political situation in Bukovina, it'll have its own history. Now, Galicia is largely divided between three different ethno-linguistic groups. Generally speaking, we call them Poles, Ruthenians, and Jews. But these terms are problematic. First of all, don't think for a second that we're talking about nations or nationalities. We are a century away from any kind of national movement. We don't have any kind of feeling of nationhood among even the Poles, much less the Ruthenians or the Jews. We don't have yet any sense of modern nationalism. But even the notion of ethnic identity is quite problematic. I'll give you, the obvious example is the Ruthenians. The Ruthenians are the ancestors, for the most part, of people today who consider themselves Ukrainians. But they didn't yet know what they were at that time. Even ethnically, it wasn't clear. But even the Poles, and I'll give you an example. In 1846, there was an uprising in Krakow, which we'll speak about in a few classes. And in that uprising, the Polish gentry rose up against Austrian rule and said to the Polish-speaking peasants, "Come, my brothers, my Polish brothers, the time of our national freedom has arrived. It's overthrow the Austrian rule and reestablish the state," and so on. And the Polish-speaking peasants rose up and slaughtered the gentry. And they went to the Austrians and said, "We're with you. We're with you." Now, why would they do such a thing? A lot of reasons. But one of them was clearly that their primary identity was not Polishness. They were primarily, first and foremost, serfs and peasants and Austrians and saw their lot better with the Austrian Empire. We were a ways away from a Polish national movement. Yet we do speak in any event about Poles, Ruthenians, and Jews in some sense, and Jews also. What they were, I don't know, but they certainly existed. They existed. That much we can say. Where did they live? Well, if you look at the map here, demographically, the province was split. You can see the purple and the yellow. Of course, it's a rough estimate. Roughly along the San River. In the western part of Galicia was mostly Polish, and by the way, today is mostly in Poland, based in the capital of Krakow. Mostly Polish with a significant Jewish minority. Jews were maybe 7.5% of Western Galicia. In the eastern portion, it's more complicated. Mostly Ukrainian, but a large Polish minority, especially in the cities. And Jews are more prominent there, maybe 13% of the population. So if you do the math, about 3/4 of Galician Jews are living in the east. And when they come into the empire, they are coming in culturally, economically, and otherwise identical to the Jews captured by the Russian Empire. What does that mean? It means, number one, they are Yiddish speaking. And by the way, we'll talk about this another time, but Yiddish speaking, but Hebrew, or rather Hebrew Aramaic as a scholarly language. Yiddish is not a written language yet, for the most part, other than private correspondence. All scholarship will be produced in the scholarly class in this Hebrew Aramaic language. And that becomes very important when we speak about the Haskalah and later Zionism. But in any event, and that's totally normal. The bilingualism is totally normal of a pre-modern society. So Yiddish speaking, it means religiously traditional, soon to be Hasidic, more on that tomorrow. It means the rhythm of life, from birth to death, from morning to night, from week to week, is set by Jewish ritual and Jewish customs. Even as Jews are part of the landscape, yes they are, but the rhythm of life is set by Jewish culture. And it's a largely commercial class, economically distinct from the non-Jews around them. So for example, 77% of Poles are involved in agriculture. 95% of the Ruthenians are involved in agriculture. They don't have a ruling gentry. 95% of Ruthenians are involved in agriculture. 14% of the Jews are there. So as a result of that, 2% of those in agricultural sector are Jews versus 71% of those in trade. And later on, when Jews enter the professional class, 1/3 of the professionals are Jews. So ethnicity is being reinforced not simply by language and religion, but also by occupation between Jews and non-Jews, and later between Poles and Ruthenians. Moreover, Jews are highly urbanized, really an almost dominant presence despite large numbers in rural areas and small towns. So for example, the two most important cities in Galicia, Krakow and Lemberg, later Lviv, later Lviv, over 1/4 of the population is Jewish. They're a majority or plurality in countless other towns. And overall, and just listen to this for a second, overall, Nearly half of all city and town residents in eastern Galicia were Jewish, many with absolute majorities. And about a third in western Galicia is Jewish. That's an incredible presence. Economically, demographically, and eventually this will mean politically, Jews were a major factor in Galicia. Now, some of this is true throughout Poland. Some of this is unique to the Galician context alone. And as this develops, we'll see this going in a different direction than other parts of the empire. So let's talk about that impact for a little bit. With the annexation of Galicia in 1772, Austria's Jewish population more than doubles to about 400,000, over half of whom are living in the new crown land of Galicia. Unlike Russia, Austria has a long history of Jews. Russia had expelled their Jews centuries earlier, so that's a whole different story. Maria Teresa, famously devout Catholic, and also a rather, as she's been described, severe anti-Semite. She famously, for example, expelled the Jews from Prague in 1744. She's suddenly confronted with this huge Jewish population, and the first legislation is designed to curb its growth. So, for example, in 1773, she imposes draconian restrictions on the right to marry and orders the deportation of all Jewish vagrants. Who's a Jewish vagrant? Anyone who has failed to pay the Jewish poll tax for 3 consecutive years for themselves and their families. By the way, Jews are going to avoid this marriage restriction simply by not marrying. What will happen is they'll have religious ceremonies alone, and they'll never tell the state. This is a huge problem for the state, which we'll come back to later on. But it's one of the reasons why the so-called number of children born out of wedlock in Galicia is astronomically high, because they're trying to avoid the civil marriage, which is always going to be a problem. We'll come back to that again. Maria Teresa largely left internal Jewish administration intact, and Jewish communities retain significant autonomy, judicial, education, charity structure, and so on. A few years later, in 1776, she promulgates a single Galician Jewish ordinance designed to ensure a more efficient tax collection system. And she actually had instituted and increased a variety of particular Jewish taxes. And she forms this general directory of the Jews, which is designed to distribute the tax income among the communities. And there's 6 different districts established with another 6 at-large representatives and so on, and the provincial chief rabbi for the first time. And this provincial chief rabbi, he not only was serving as chief rabbi of the Jews in Galicia, but also had an administrative role with the government. And this is rather unprecedented, because now the rabbi is being co-opted into the arm of the state. And the goal here again is absolutism. Absolutism, the ideology that says power must be focused in the central monarch, that all other castes, other intermediaries to the population need to be broken down as much as possible. So, for example, she begins to assert control over religious services. She bans private services except in small communities that lacked a synagogue, and even there, they could only have religious services without a Torah scroll. Even there. And there's also growing control, of course, over Catholic education, Catholic religious services, and so on. Her son, she dies in 1780, and her son, Joseph II, views the province also as an absolutist, but what we normally call enlightened absolutism, and those of you who've done the reading by now have read all about this, or revolutionary enlightened absolutism, as Larry Wolff calls it. I think that your reading today from Nancy Sinkoff captures this quite nicely. The crafting of the state's policies in the spirit of the progressive, optimistic, and rationalizing trends of the European Enlightenments that valorized individual self-cultivation and morality, while still professing a belief in an omnipotent and omniscient creator and the just irrigation of power by one ruler. Enlightened absolutism. And Joseph believed in it. He truly did. But he also saw it as the best way, as she puts it, to thwart social unrest. And this notion of Josephinism, it was very much in contrast, again, to this barbaric, untamed Galicia, which had to be tamed, especially its Jews. That means that administrative centralization has to be focused on Vienna. It means also the relaxation of censorship. It means the partial abolition of serfdom. Peasants given additional personal freedoms. It means the assault on noble privilege. Nobility can no longer, for example, expel a serf or a peasant for no reason. Peasants are given more freedom, children could learn a trade, and so on and so forth. And this is part of the whole ideology of mercantilism or cameralism, a centralized and efficient state, all resources guided to strengthen the state for the benefit of all subjects. And here we have Joseph II. He's not the divine right king. He is first servant of the state, all towards the state. And the idea of the policy was to promote the maximum economic development of the empire and its subjects, especially through industry and commerce. But in this regard, Galicia was to be a market for Austrian and Bohemian industry rather than develop its own. And now that Galicia, by the way, is cut off from its former markets and the other parts of the Commonwealth that are controlled by Russia and Prussia, Posen and so on, that means that essentially the feudal system is going to persist until the end of the 19th century and even beyond in some ways. As absolutists, they sought to break down social castes between curtailing the power of the nobility, raising the rights of the legal status of the peasants. And the same would go for the Jewish caste. The Jews are essentially, in pre-modern European society, they're a caste. They are a group with a specific list of rights and obligations and privileges and so on, a type of a state. And he wants to incorporate the Jews into the empire as much as all of the other subjects. And he's going to be influenced especially by discourse at the time talking about Jewish productivization, especially occupational. And this means moving them from commerce and trade, which was viewed at the time as being somehow parasitical, towards crafts and agriculture, which somehow seemed more productive, more also morally wholesome, to integrate the Jews into broader society. And there's an Enlightenment influence going on here. But also, it's not just the Enlightenment. It also reflects greater Habsburg hopes for Germanizing the Slavic province. And again, Germanizing means taming. It means civilizing. And Jews are a critical part of this project. And I want to contrast for a moment this language of Germanization, because we're reading in this class at several points the work of the famous historian Mahler and other older scholars as well, where they view Germanization through the lens of assimilation. And we have to make the distinction. It's not simply assimilation. It's, Mahler can point to things that are quite negative. The kosher meat tax is instituted in 1784, and Jewish leases on alcohol licenses, on mills and so on. This is curtailed in 1785, and we'll speak about that in a little bit. But in general, the goal is not malicious assimilation in some sort of science fiction sense, the way that Zionism will later use the term as well. But rather, it's to strengthen the German presence in the province and incorporate the province into the empire as part of this goal of civilizing the province, including the Jews. Not converting them for sure, not assimilating them, but some kind of radical social integration and acculturation. So what are the enactments? You'll see what I'm talking about here. 1787, these are just a few of the enactments coming out of Joseph II. 1787, Galician Jews required to adopt German family names. 1788, Jewish clothing is going to be banned as of 1791, although this doesn't get enforced. Much of this doesn't get enforced, as a matter of fact. And in 1788, the military draft. Jews become liable for the military service. But again here, you have to point out, the military draft, this is not like in Tsarist Russia. Many of you are familiar with the stories of the Cantonists, for example, in the Tsarist Empire when Nicholas I first drafts the Jews and the stories surrounding them. The goal was rather to equalize Jewish service to the state. And, for example, there was leeway to Jewish soldiers for Sabbath observance when possible. Jews were put in transport units often, although not exclusively, to help them with that. This is a different situation. This is an equalizing opportunity in many ways. But of course, Jewish soldiers, detached from Jewish communal life, detached from parts of religious observance, and Jewish leaders certainly feared that these people might be candidates for assimilation. And we actually are going to begin to see a polarization between Jewish reformers on one side, on the side of Enlightenment and on the side of the government, and Jewish traditionalists drawing on religion and custom in new ways, especially once Hasidism takes root, against them. And we'll see that more in the next two lessons, this growing polarization between these sectors of Jewish society. Under Joseph, communal autonomy also going to be restricted, but again, lots of communal autonomies are going to be restricted because this is an enlightened absolutist regime. Joseph liquidated the general directory established by his mother and also liquidated the office of chief rabbi. He liquidated the judicial autonomy of the Kehilot. These are now going to be exclusively religious and charitable organizations. They're going to be reformulated, now called Kultusgemeinden, cultural religious communities, something like this. And they're going to have a few civic functions, for example, registering births and deaths, but for the most part are going to be religious structures alone. 141 of them in particular are going to be established, still a highly ramified governing and taxation structure, and Jews are theoretically compensated for that loss of autonomy, which was sort of the identity of pre-modern period, theoretically compensated with access to municipal political office. But that often remained on paper alone. We'll see later on that often theoretical access to municipal governance, but in the broader cities, that often didn't translate in reality. After a 6-year period, only those with a fluency in German would be eligible as Kehila leaders, and Hebrew and Yiddish, including German written in Hebrew characters, were banned in Jewish public and commercial records. Henceforth, all Kehila records, birth and death registers and so on, all must be kept in the German language. And this was a critical part of the structure of the government, obviously, because army recruitment and tax and so on are coming from these records. In 1789, the emperor obligated Jewish children to attend German language schools, a decree that was enforced indirectly by requiring proof of this attendance in order to obtain a marriage license or to serve as a community rabbi. And in the former regard, again, Jews could circumvent that simply by not getting married officially, by only getting married under a chuppah and not actually getting married with the state. And this is part, again, of a broader reform of education throughout the empire, well beyond Jews. They're establishing so-called Normalschulen and a whole system of elementary and post-elementary education to bring literacy to the countryside, to achieve an elementary education among everybody at least. And there was pushback from others, not only, as we'll see in a second, from Jewish rabbinical establishment. The Catholic Church, for example, also pushing back in some cases. The Jews are part of a broader phenomenon. And actually the first such German language Jewish school was established already in the early 1780s in Lemberg. And the man most associated with these schools is on your screen right now, Herz Homberg. He is a very interesting character. I wish I had more time to discuss him. In the older scholarship, he was viewed very much as almost an evil person, really. Terrible person. He was a maskil. We'll learn about that tomorrow. He was a person who sought to bring enlightenment to the Jewish community. He also was problematic. He was one of the people involved with the candle tax, which was a very hated tax against the Jews. We'll speak about in a minute. So in the Galician Jewish memory, he is viewed in very negative terms. But essentially, more recent scholarship, especially led by Racham and others, is really showing that he was not so terrible. Actually, he was a normal maskil. He was not a heretic against Jewish religion. He was trying to bring educational reform to the Jewish system, some kind of standardized pedagogy, basic sciences, and so on. I think that the efforts, on the one hand, of progressive but religious Jewish figure trying to push educational reform against a system that's entrenched in an old way that is pedagogically problematic and lacks any kind of modern system, I think it's something that maybe today, as I'm recording in Haifa, we can think about, and it's not so foreign. But in any event, an interesting guy, and you can read about him on your own. These schools are Jewish schools staffed with Jewish teachers. Every kehillah was required to establish and fund such a school. But all of their pedagogy and so on had to be approved by a state-appointed administrator. Herz Homberg was the head of this whole system. And you have, by 1792, 100 of these schools in Galicia. They eventually enroll about 4,000 students before they're shut down in 1806. The whole system was shut down in 1806. So that's going to have an impact. And all of these decrees are going to receive an official ratification in 1789 in the form of a Judenordnung, a Jewish ordinance issued for all of Galicia. And this is part of a system of edicts of toleration issued across the 1780s for the various parts of the Austrian Empire. And it was part of that whole series of edicts trying to, in some ways, actually, it's quite liberating for the Jewish community. So I'll read you, for example, part of the preamble of the purpose. The purpose was, quote, to annul the differences which legislation has so far maintained between Christian and Jewish subjects, and to grant the Jews living in Galicia all the benefits and rights which our other subjects enjoy, end quote. I mean, enlightened absolutism meant that to promote economic and individual development, limited and sometimes less, not so limited civil rights would be granted. Freedom of Jews to settle in towns and in agricultural areas, in villages, if they farmed. They couldn't go there and become leasers like they used to be, but they could go there if they were farming. Access to handicrafts and to guilds that had been closed to Jews in the past, assuming a Christian master would take them. Permission to open factories. Permission to have Christian servants. Also guaranteed freedom of worship with specifics, although there were certain limitations to assure Catholic superiority. But, for example, private synagogues could now be established freely, not for free. They had to pay a special tax, but they could be established freely. And that tax, by the way, again, it wasn't just the money. It served to fortify the direct relationship of the individual Jews to the central government. That tax lasted until 1810, after which it was waived. I mean, to be sure, the edict has problems, and guys like Mahler really focus on these. For example, it left the decision to grant municipal citizenship and civil rights to local city authorities, and they universally refused to award them. Jews will not gain that kind of power yet, that kind of emancipation yet. And it retained various special taxes on the Jews. For example, the kosher meat tax, the marriage tax, and even the toleration tax, which besides the money obviously was quite degrading. And besides this, you have this lofty language opening up many vocations to the Jews that were heretofore forbidden. But the Jewish ban on settlement in the villages, except for those engaged in agriculture and handicrafts, that was retained. Jews are still forbidden to hold leases or distill or sell liquor, which had once been, and by the way, off the record, will continue to be central to their economic activity. And this is really the rub, by the way. I wish we had more time to speak about it. But the role of Jews as leasers, and especially in alcohol, this is very important. And this will be part of the discourse of Jewish and relations with the other ethnic groups in the province and with the state throughout the 19th century. And again, the goal of all of this, in conjunction with the earlier decrees, especially education, it was Germanization, social integration, turning the province into a civilized German place, and Jews are part of that. Now, Joseph dies in 1790, and in the wake of Napoleonic turmoil, his successors are going to roll back many of these progressive reforms of the various edicts of toleration, but they're going to leave untouched some of the more oppressive aspects. So above all, of course, they want to have the Germanization. They like this, but not always consistently. So what are some of those acts you see here? So for example, in 1797, you have the famous candle tax, a tax that Jews had to pay, not when you bought you had to pay it whether or not you actually lit the Sabbath candles or not. And this becomes, by the way, a symbol of the hatred of the Jews, of the persecution of the Jews in the empire. And when it's rolled back, when it's eventually canceled, it becomes a symbol of their emancipation as well. In 1806, German is required for all officials of the Jewish community. That was the same year, by the way, remember that Hamburg schools were closed. In 1810, German language, the ability of the German language is required to vote in community elections. And 1814, and by the way, this is going to come up later in late 19th century period, Hebrew and Yiddish documents are specifically invalidated as evidence in courts or in government bureaus. Yiddish language is going to be a big issue because Yiddish is quite close to German, I'm sure you know. And so the problem of Yiddish as a sort of degenerate German, symbolic of that degeneracy of the Jews who speak it, becomes a continuing issue throughout the 19th century, especially after 1867, as we'll see another time. At the same time this is happening, the Polish nobility are sort of reconciling themselves to Austrian rule, and they're using the language of rights to re-secure their traditional privileges, as well as the role of the Jews as their agents. So the economy, despite some of the earlier best intentions of Joseph II, the economy is going to continue as before in many ways. Jewish leaseholders, for example, are going to continue to run the alcoholic beverage industry, and there's going to be no move yet of Jews out of the villages. So what was the success rate? How did they do? how successful were the Austrian officials' efforts at Germanization, at social integration, and so on? Well, on the one hand, the tiny Jewish elite, nearly all Germanized during these years, wealthy merchants, leases of Jewish taxes, the meat and candle tax and so on, members of the professional intelligentsia, and the maskilim, the enlightened Jews supported by those earlier people, all of them are going to move towards Germanization. And Vienna's Germanization program is going to feed quite nicely into the growth of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which is going to look to Berlin for inspiration and guidance at first. And these people proudly speak German, they educate their children in the German language and culture, and they are absolutely loyal to the German Habsburg monarch, and they become Deutschen, German, but in the cultural sense, not in any national sense, but in a cultural sense, meaning, as you see from the picture of the famous Moskil Krachmal, meaning they cut their peyot, their sidelocks. It means they wear short German-style coats instead of long kaftans and so on, and they're distinguished from the Polish Jews. Not that they're Polish in any kind of national or ethnic or linguistic identity, but because they're traditional. They wear peyot, they wear the long kaftan, they don't speak German, they speak Yiddish. The Polish Jews speak Yiddish. Keep that in mind. They also construct German-style reformed temples, and that's one from Krakow that survived the Holocaust. But when we say reform, don't have in mind the kind of radical reform that's happening in Germany. Actually, the temples are a lot closer to what we might call modern Orthodox today. But nevertheless, German. So the one founded in Lemberg, in Lviv, is called the Deutsche Israelitisches Bethaus, the German Israelite temple or synagogue. Later it will Polonize its name, but not till much, much later. And even though these temples are not reform, they're reform enough to generate a lot of hostility between the members and rabbis of these places and the traditional establishment. So much so that the rabbi of the Lemberg temple, Abraham Cohen, is actually poisoned and murdered along with one of his daughters in 1848. Ad kedei kach, as they say in Hebrew. Germanization also took root among the Jewish masses. All of them obediently adopted German family names. Jewish knowledge of German language expanded in general, especially because Yiddish was so close to German. That does increase. A lot of students attended Homburg schools or some of the other German Jewish schools that are established in the early 19th century. You have about 14 cities by mid-century that have such schools with thousands of students going through them. And these are German through and through. German, they're officially known as German Israelite institutions. German is being taught as, quote, the mother language of Galician Israelites, and so on. So Germanization, there is some success. On the other hand, its success was largely limited by a lot of factors, not the least of which was the spread of Hasidism in the early decades of the 19th century. As we'll see next class or in two classes, Hasidism had perhaps its greatest success in Galicia of anywhere. And Hasidic leaders adamantly opposed government and maskilic attempts at Germanization. And this opposition sometimes really straddled the border between religious vigilance and just outright ethnicism. So, for example, the famous Hasidic leader in Galicia, Menachem Mendel or Rimanov, he uses a midrash, an interpretation of a biblical passage that's often used by Zionists, actually, at the end of the century. There's a famous story, by what merit were the ancient Hebrews redeemed from Egypt in the Exodus story? And the rabbis are confused about it because, after all, the tradition tells them that the ancient Hebrews had become almost completely swallowed by Egyptian culture, worshiping idols and so on. But the Midrash tells us they were redeemed because of three things. They didn't change their language, they didn't change their names, and they didn't change their clothes, meaning their fashion, obviously. So what that means is they didn't acculturate. And based on that, they were redeemed by God. Now, this is a very popular midrash, as you can imagine, by Zionists because it's arguing against acculturation. Ironically, we'll see, because Zionists themselves were the most acculturated. But for him to use this in the early 19th century is really quite remarkable. Pushing for cultural uniqueness. This is really the birth of what we'll later call orthodoxy. Keep your children as much as possible from foreign tongues, and God will bring his nation to speedy deliverance in our day, as he did for our forefathers in Egypt. Now, these German Jewish schools were run by prominent maskilim, speak about the Haskalah tomorrow, with curriculum that's reflecting this philosophy. So Orthodox opponents are going to rally against them, and they'll often prefer the public Christian schools, which at least in their mind doesn't desanctify the Jewish tradition by teaching it through modern methods. That's one area of undermining Germanization success. And also the Austrian bureaucrats themselves. Following, in this reactionary period following Napoleonic turmoil, a lot of the Austrian bureaucrats, a lot of the Austrian leaders are quite skeptical of reforming Jewish society as the Maskilim wanted. They simply wanted to placate it. They wanted to keep things quiet. And most importantly, I would say, the socioeconomic composition of Galician Jewry, which is still in the early 19th century quite similar to other areas of Poland, much more so than, say, other parts of Central Europe, it was simply not especially conducive to Germanization. I mean, you have to ask yourself, into which socioeconomic group were the Jews supposed to integrate? In Berlin or elsewhere in Central Europe and elsewhere in Europe. There's no German middle class that existed there in Galicia. How are the Jews supposed to integrate when they themselves constitute 3/4 or more of the commercial class? The only agency they could integrate into was the bureaucracy, but that was largely closed to the Jews. So with no significant non-Jewish German middle class available to absorb them, the real effect of these efforts was simply not to transform the Jews into Germans, but rather to widen the cultural gap between the Jews who do Germanize and Slavic neighbors on the one hand and other Jews on the other hand. We can see some of this failure of Germanization in the following. There's a Galician journal penned by an Austrian German-speaking bureaucrat describing the Jews in 1821. Some of this is imagined, but it gives us a flavor, a sense of what's going on. Here's the quote. "The Jewish people, even in dispersal, has so steadily preserved the uneffaced stamp of nationality, a special kind of existence, a completely singular relation. Thus they may share with us the common protection of the law and the advantages brought to Europe by the progress of enlightenment, the growth of industry, and the improvement of education. But they preserve all the marks of an individual tribe. Ultimately, there is the constant resistance which governments today experience, resistance to the assimilation of this people with regard to various forms, resistance to the imposition of equal obligations, resistance to closer unification through the bonds of a common fatherland and common destinies." Now, be careful with this terminology, nationality and so on. Don't use it in a way that they didn't mean, but you do get a sense of the limits of this effort in the early 19th century. Now, there is an effort by this man, the famous Metternich of Austria, of trying to blend the province's various religious and ethnic groups, trying to blend them into Galicians, to, as Larry Wolff put it, to make Galicians, now that they've invented Galicia, invent the Galicians. And that was the effort. The idea would be to eventually Germanize the province in this sense. So, for example, Metternich created the Galician Sem, its diet, its parliament, as part of the effort to forge a uniquely Galician identity. And this works to an extent. You do see people thinking about the Galician fatherland by the mid-19th century. In fact, even in the later 19th century, we'll see nationalists themselves still talking about the Galician fatherland or the Galician motherland. But ultimately, that effort is going to be overcome by those national and religious and ethnic differences. So what he hopes to accomplish, he wants to turn the Poles and Ruthenians and Jews into Galicians. And he succeeds to an extent. But eventually, when those Galicians become Poles, they're going to bring along with them the Germans and others who also had become Galicians, and they'll also become Poles, and a number of Jews with them to boot. In any event, Metternich, I have to end with him, he never quite overcame his image of Galicia. Galicia was, quote, a place of rags, dirt, Jews, disease, misery, and death, in that order. So, we come to the end of the first part. Moving ahead, we have to talk about the most important Jewish movements in early 19th century Eastern Europe, early 19th century Galicia. Number one, Hasidism, which, as I said, achieved some of its greatest success in Galicia as anywhere. And second of all, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which is born in Berlin, is born in Central Western Europe, but is going to move into Eastern Europe through the Austrian province because of that German connection. Following these two movements, we can then look at the process of emancipation, especially from 1848, and then how the Jews would become transformed by that process of emancipation, which completed in 1867. Thanks.